Welcome to this conversation with Open-Ended Design. We speak with activists and creators from around the world about design, technology, and culture, unpacking their work, generating new ideas, and exploring their dreams for the future. Welcome to this open-ended conversation with Katie Patrick, an environmental engineer and software designer based in San Francisco. Katie works at the intersection of environmental behavior, gamification, and tech, tackling complex environmental issues by applying data-driven game and behavior change techniques. She hosts her own podcast, How to Save the World. It looks at how to make changing the world the greatest game ever played. She has collaborated with the United Nations, NASA, Google, and Stanford, and has now founded multiple climate-focused platforms and startups, including urbancanopy.io, an app that uses satellite imaging in urban heat islands to encourage urban greening and cooling initiatives. These days, Katie is busy building a Fitbit for the planet to show people real-time data from sensors and satellites to help them measure their own environmental footprint. I loved her energy, her honesty about what it means to feel like an outsider, and what it feels like to stumble. I found it really moving at a time when I was feeling unsure of myself and stuck in a dark place. I hope you enjoy this conversation. So I wanted to start maybe at the very present. Is what is it that you do right now? I know that there's multiple streams of work, but I'd love to hear from you, in your own words, better than my summarizing it, what your work is right now, and then we can go into the story of how it came about.
Yeah, I'd love to. Now, I do have to preface it to say, like, I'm a bit of an octopus. Like, I go in multiple directions, and it can look like things on the surface are more developed than they really are because I love coming up with ideas and starting new things. And I start a lot of new things all the time just because I find it really, really fun. The most recent new thing I started was something called the Imagine Project, which I just launched 2 weeks ago, which is really just trying to cultivate a movement and bring people together around the idea of imagining a better Earth. The environmental movement has had a very strong doomish and negative message. The environmental movement was built from reacting to environmental devastation. So it's kind of embedded in the DNA of everything we've come from to say, let's stop this bad thing happening. But now we're getting a lot more sophisticated in terms of an industry, in terms of a profession. And I think that whole message of saying, there's all these problems has kind of maybe had its time. And now we're really seeing a zeitgeist in a kind of new age of let's tell a story about what is the future we want to create? What is the new world? What can we be optimistic about? What can we design? What is this new kind of singularity we're going to come up against, which is when technology and ecosystems can come together in a beautiful symbiosis instead of technology, destroying nature. It can actually support and work with nature. What are cities going to look like when they're covered in plants and animals and wildlife corridors and vegetable gardens coming off the side of city buildings and kids growing their own food? I mean, we can imagine the world like it can be our tapestry of the future, and we can actually have the agency to create it. Just because the world got covered in concrete and freeways and coal power stations doesn't mean that it has to be that way, right? We can imagine a new world, and we can actually find the agency and figure out how to actually make it come true. And I'm really passionate about just that overall way of thinking. It could be a lot of things. So I just started to explore this. I really just want to try to expand this movement by just creating a group. So I started this thing called the Imagination Project, or the Imagine Project, which is really just coming together once a month on Zoom to talk about how can we imagine this better world? How can we create more artwork, more ideas about it? How can we, I'm calling it action hacking, how can we sort of reverse action hack into these ideas and actually make it happen? And we have a Discord server where we chat, and that's it. So it's really nice to see the kind of like snowball start, and it's kind of connected to my overall mission in terms of like deeply trying to understand environmental psychology as an academic profession. I discovered it about 8 years ago that there was this field called environmental psychology, and there were people who had PhDs in it, and they studied the real nuances of what made environmental change like happen, like what got people to recycle. Sometimes it's simple things like recycling or getting people to use less plastic, these simple individual behaviors, but it's also big things like what gets people to accept A carbon tax, what makes governments be able to sort of like pass through policy, and all these sort of nuances of identity and social diffusion theory. It's really, really deep and rich. And one dimension of this that keeps coming up over and over again is that societies change by having a vision, by having a dream, like the Martin Luther King "I have a dream" speech. Like, that's what we need. That is how social movements change, is that they have a dream that is different to the current world. Something in the current world is bad, and we have an alternative of a future dream, and then we work towards that dream. And in the environmental movement, I felt like we haven't had enough of that. We've been so problem centric. It's really time to get really solution centric and really sort of create these tipping points and these big social movements, that we need to create change happen. And if we don't kind of have the dream and the vision crystallized, I mean, we can't always be just hating on climate change all the time without a vision of where we want to go. So part of it's kind of like fun, biophilic cities and green walls are fun, but it's deeply rooted in the academic social science of what creates social movements. Re-engineering the entire world's technology and systems to become ecologically sustainable is an enormous task that is hundreds of times bigger than the moon landing and going to Mars. And one meeting with government leaders around the world is not going to make that happen. So let's just calibrate our expectations that meetings and conferences are really not what is going to make the change happen. It's decade after decade of really deep innovation, of tinkering, of problem solving, of ripping out concrete, of planting trees, of putting in solar panels. It's all of that real on the ground work that is really where the change is. And so, I mean, when I see COP26, it's like, oh, great, another one of these big conferences, and then everybody's going to complain that the world didn't magically transform. So I think just calibrating expectations for what these things can provide is a good place to start. But I just feel that in the last couple of years, we're really starting to reach a tipping point with climate change, which is really exciting. Like, I read my first book on climate change when I was 16. It was called Too Hot to Handle, and it was back when atmospheric carbon dioxide was not that high. I don't know what it was back then, 350, 380, and then it started to get up over 400 a couple of years ago. And nobody really heard about it much. It wasn't, in the zeitgeist. And now, 25 years later, like, people have been telling me my whole life, oh, nobody really cares about the environment. Katie, you're so passionate about it, but you're an outlier. Everybody's selfish. They're not going to really do anything. Like, everybody's just driven by money. This is this message you spend as a career environmentalist. And I've never really believed it. I think people I think we all have the capacity to believe in big, bold, powerful, transformative things. I don't think we're selfish and we just care about money and appearances, and I don't think people are that simple.
I also am not surprised that with your sense of optimism and belief in real innovation, you ended up in Silicon Valley, and that's where you've been living. And what obviously strikes most people, I think, for me, it was really powerful when I started following you on LinkedIn and then on Twitter, was that you're an activist, you're somebody who can translate problems for people like myself. You're able to drive a connection between the issue, the solution, the innovation, and then just actually communicating it, which is rare in any technical field. But also you're a maker, and you're somebody who's constantly designing, and part of it is really setting an example for the rest of us, or for people at least in your field, in the field of software innovation, for what is possible. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about some of your work with Fitbit for the Planet, and the Chrome extension that you built, Energy Lollipop, Urban Canopy, just to give us a sense of what it is that you've been making. And I wonder how much these projects have come kind of chronologically in your career, but also how you've decided on what to focus on and where to put your energy. Because I think another issue with climate change is that it is so vast that people feel extremely intimidated with applying their skill sets to any kind of issue.
Oh, and thank you for your kind words. It's nice to be seen and appreciated. And I mean, yeah, I did end up in Silicon Valley because I have an enormously curious mind, and I kind of felt like I found my people here. Like, not so much environmentally, but people who are just like, yeah, let's just spend the weekend with sensors and Arduinos and like writing code. And I kind of like was like, oh, all these people are just like sort of like as mentally fertile and kind of nerdy as I am. And I did not find that community in Australia. So I did find it here. where do I start with that question? So I'll just go and list the kind of projects I've been working on, and then I'll get into the how I kind of got here, which is a bit of a weird, unusual kind of story. So I got really curious as about the carbon emissions in the grid. I just overall theory, why can't we just show a number? Why can't we just show everybody the number? Just show people a number that we need to change, and then we'll design it in a way that looks nice, and then maybe people will change in response to the number. Really simple design theory about feedback loops, which is why I call it Fitbit for the planet design. Show people the number, just like a Fitbit. And you would think this would be an easy thing to do, but when you start looking at the environmental problems, you realize that there isn't always the data. It's not very well designed. You can't get it in real time. You can't get it per suburb. You might only be able to get it for like a whole state like California. So looking at the carbon dioxide in the electricity grid, I realized that there was this one data feed from the California ISO. That's the organization that regulates the electricity grid, that shows you the real-time carbon emissions. And it's this little tiny black chart that's stuck deep in their website that you have to kind of like hunt around to find, right? And when we talk about climate change, it's the only thing that matters is the CO2 we're trying to get down. So I thought about how I could get everybody to see this number, and it fluctuates enormously. We have a lot of solar in California, so the carbon dioxide is basically, we have completely clean electricity during the day. It's 100% clean, depending on the weather, but mostly it's clean. And then in the late afternoon, when the sun starts to go down, we have 74 gas power stations, and they all turn on, and then they make all of this electricity for people to have dinner and watch TV and all that sort of thing. And then it's sort of like medium through the night. And on hot days, it absolutely goes through the roof because air conditioners draw enormous amount of kilowatt hours, so much so that they even run out of electricity. Like the electricity grid has gone down multiple times in summer, and it's a real problem for California. And so you can really see this pattern by just looking at the CO2. It's fun to watch because it goes right down, it goes right up every single day, and changes depending on the weather and the season. And so I thought, how do we best show this to people? And I thought, well, let's create a giant outdoor light that shows it. It'll be out on the street, and you drive past it and you get to see the CO2 emissions, and we'll have all the colors of the rainbow: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, depending on it. And then I thought, well, that's actually a pretty big job to buy a giant outdoor light and figure out how to install it. What is the simplest, most reductive version of that? And so we thought Chrome extension. And so a friend and I, we programmed it up, and we made this really lovely and very stable Chrome extension that I would invite anyone to install. You just Google Energy Lollipop Chrome extension. You can try it, and you can see this pattern. It's just for California, but it's fun. And I have since bought a giant outdoor light. It's actually sitting in my hallway right now. I don't know how to install it, but I will figure it out so it can actually go out on the street and show the same data. And it's enormously informative because you just really see that, solar panels are great. They work well, electricity in the day. And then you realize what an enormous design challenge it is to get the CO2 out of the dinner time spike. And no one around the world has figured this out unless you're on nuclear or hydropower. It's a really, really hard problem to solve, and there's nowhere near enough batteries solving it. So that kind of is that particular project. Another one called Urban Canopy is my interest in urban heat islands. I thought it would be really fun to take thermal photographs of buildings, partly because I wanted to promote green roofs and have this passion for biophilic cities. I thought, well, maybe if we just take a thermal camera and we photograph a building.
A biophilic city? What's a biophilic city?
Biophilic city. Biophilic, bio means plants and life, and philic means love. So it's a phrase that describes cities that are covered in plants. So imagine green roofs, green walls, lots of trees, lots of vines, lots of gardens, not much asphalt, not much concrete. They use it a phrase they use that's really lovely in biophilic cities is a city in a garden as opposed to a garden in a city. So imagine you have a beautiful, enormous garden, and the buildings are kind of inside that rather than all concrete with one isolated little park. It's a really beautiful.
Does this exist,
phrase.
or is it still it's still part of the imagination of somebody somewhere?
Oh, no, I think the biophilic cities movement is pretty established. I mean, you've got landscape architects, green roofers, green walls, all of the arborists, the people who plant trees. There's the Biophilic Cities Association. I gave a guest lecture for them. There's a conference coming up called Cities Alive by the Green Roof Association. I'm also talking at that about how to apply behaviour change principles to encourage more green cities. So no, it's a fairly established industry. I mean, there's a lot of people who look after urban plants and trees, and they have software and contracts, and we just want more of it. We just want more. But in this in thinking about like, oh, like how can I encourage more of this, I thought thermal photography would be really fun, right? Because it's like the hot bits come up red, and then there's like orange and yellow and green. And I thought if there was like a wall on a building that would be really hot, you could photograph it with a thermal camera, and I could go to the building owner and be like, your building's really, really hot. Would you like to? Why don't you have a green wall? So it was really kind of like a sales mechanism that I thought I could sell biophilic cities with. And I just like fell into this tunnel of fascination about thermal photography. I mean, it is so interesting to look at all of the temperature, about how cities work and different materials and plants. And so I ended up becoming fairly close with the NASA JPL team who study urban heat islands and have this new sensor on the space station called EcoStress. And they learned this machine learning process of putting together multiple types of satellite imagery to get a much higher resolution of thermal photography than had ever been done before. And the reason why it hadn't really been done by satellites is because the resolution was just so low, like 1 pixel for a kilometer. Like, what can you tell by that, right? But we found this way of getting reasonably high resolution where you can really see individual buildings and roads and stuff, and do it all from space, do it all for free. No need to spend any fancy amount of money on it. And started creating these maps of the urban heat island, and we have a really beautiful one of Los Angeles, and you can get it through my website, and you really see like how hot the roads are, how hot the car parks are, how hot the poor neighborhoods are versus the rich neighborhoods. Like, you cannot avoid seeing the trees and parks 10 to 20 degrees cooler, and just how hot some neighborhoods are. And they're always the poor neighborhoods, they're always where the box stores and the car parks are. And it's really amazing to be able to see those surface temperature maps of summer. And obviously, like, the natural call to action is we need more trees. It sort of does its purpose.
You're now a software, you're a tech or environmental engineer, but you started off as an architect. So as you approach each of these collaborations, what hat do you put on, and how much space do you have to kind of I don't know, think about what comes next, or how much of it is just evolving completely naturally?
It's super random, and it's random on purpose, like by design. So I mean, I grew up in an artist household. Like, my family's German, and my grandfather was a graphic designer, and my grandmother was a fashion designer, and they were quite accomplished, but they were real technical artists. Like, my grandfather had to, he would be able to paint the font on a billboard and a face. Back in this is like sort of post-war Germany, before there were computers, and if you were a graphic designer or a fashion designer, you didn't have a computer. You had to be able to draw properly, and that's the environment I grew up in. And then I started in my teens, started to fall in love with science, STEM, technology. And so these two kind of halves of me, of like an artist and a technologist, together. And so anyway, where I'm going with this question is about when I first got to Silicon Valley. I came here wanting to have the Silicon Valley dream. Like, I had a startup in Australia. It was quite successful. It kind of died in the end, but it had a really good run. And
what was it?
I came here wanting to sort of expand, like, you jump to the next level. I'm like, cool, I raised $1 million. I built a company, got a couple of $1 million of turnover. Okay, it kind of died, but now I'm ready to do the next step. Now I'm ready to like start the next one and raise $10 million,
What was it? What was your Australian startup? Can you share?
It was like a green directory and a sort of a media hub. It was like a while ago. So it was back when, like Yahoo was still cool, and people did like, hubs and news hubs. It was kind of like Huffington Post kind of green, but I had a publishing company, like a print publishing company, as well as the
Amazing.
as the sort of the
So
online
you've
news
always been
portal.
entrepreneurial, always.
Yeah. And I started off just making craft with my mother, selling it, making things out of clay and selling them. I think that was a really big part of where I got so just this sort of natural momentum to want to make things and sell it. Felt very natural. But where I got to,
Was your mother also an artist?
yeah, she wasn't quite as professionally accomplished as my grandparents. She was more of a stay-at-home mother, but there was definitely like all the childhood was just art, was all we did. Drawing, silk screening, clay, all of it was just totally creative. But when I got to Silicon Valley, I really didn't. I lost my confidence. I didn't feel like I could do the whole VC pitching programmer thing. My ideas weren't that good. Not like quite a different person now than I was 8 or 9 years ago when I got here. I didn't feel like I could handle talking to these big American, they seemed like these very scary big American venture capitalist men. I was very shy, and I just didn't feel like I could take that jump into the bigger pond. And I had a really lovely fiance that I broke up with at the time. I didn't want to do my old startup anymore that I came with from Australia. I felt like I'd really outgrown it. And I was in my early 30s, just kind of having like a crisis. I was like, I don't know where I'm going in life. I don't know what I want to do. Everything I thought I was doing, I'm not doing now. It doesn't feel right anymore. And I just had this feeling of like every path feels wrong. Every single path for me, I don't know which direction to go to. So I just started just following my creative energy. It was the only way I could feel my way out of this sort of life phase where I wasn't sure where to go. So I was just like, I'm just gonna be like creative. I'm just gonna put my creativity out wherever it feels like going, and I've basically been doing that ever since, without a particular sort of agenda. Like I'm not necessarily trying to build like the next big company or the, you know, whatever it is. So hence that's kind of like the octopus approach of all the tentacles. I'm just more or less doing a life experiment where I'm just fully unleashing my creative energy without any expectation for where it goes. And that's what I do every day. It hasn't been like an easy, fun path the whole time. I mean, I've been through enormous long patches of, depression and anxiety and loneliness, trying to readjust. I mean, it hasn't been all of that, of course, but it's not just this sort of fun thing where you just naturally, not in my experience, jump from one thing to another. This whole last 8 years of, or even 10 years of my life going through this change and building up the body of work and the knowledge and the kind of following I have now. I mean, I had to go through an evolution of letting go of every expectation of life, that I would ever make any money, that I would have the relationship of my dreams, the house of my dreams, that I would accomplish certain things in life. I really had to do the kind of Eckhart Tolle Zen, detach from all of the normal things that people have in life, and be able to just really, really commit to my own creative journey and not worry that, other people in Silicon Valley were much more successful. They're all raising $10 million and selling their companies to Google and to Facebook and getting big jobs and buying expensive houses here and all the things that, Silicon Valley life is like. To just let go of attachment to ever being that, and just really sort of take my own path and just invest in my own creative journey and just sort of almost like leave it up to God, leave it up to the universe. Like it's not up to me what happens. All I can do is put in my best work and make great relationships with people. So I only focus on two things, just doing really good creative work and making great relationships. And then it's not up to me what happens. It's like some things take off and wonderful things will happen, and then some things don't work, and I don't really have any control over that. All I have control over is really these two things. So I really had to let go of that. And I mean, people think it's this kind of like, oh, you're so strong, you're so driven. It didn't really come from being strong and being driven. It came from a place of being really broken. It came from a place of feeling like I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what I wanted. Nothing was feeling right. So I almost like was coming from a place of had nothing to lose. It's like, well, I could get a job as an environmental engineer at some company. That didn't feel like a great life for me. So it's almost like when you feel like you don't have anything, you're able to sort of take that leap off the cliff and fully give everything you have to the process.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. That's really powerful and really generous of you to share, because we've all been there to a certain extent. So the last thing I wanted to ask you about is your book and your podcast. I was going to ask you how you keep yourself educated and current on environment, and then I realized you have this gigantic repository of content from all of these incredible people that you're speaking with. But could you share a little bit about that and how that has evolved and what the book is about?
Yeah, so I wrote this book. I took this big dive into this environmental psychology, which really, really fascinated me. started reading up a lot of academic papers and became very intrinsically motivated to kind of intellectually master this domain of this academic research. And it was so interesting. I ended up writing a book about it because I wanted to share this particular body of knowledge so much. So it's called How to Save the World, and it's about just environmental behavior design, UI UX design, the psychology of how to get people to do stuff. Because a lot of us in the environmental lens, we think if we just educate people about climate change and the environment, people will do stuff. But one thing I really learned is that educational design and behavior design are completely different things. If you want to educate people about climate change, you go like write a book, write a textbook, make a documentary. If you want to actually get people to take action, it is an entirely different profession. So you need to go into action and behavior design. And so that's really what my book is about. And it's kind of threaded through with a very kind of like creative, optimistic tone of like, this is fun, we can do this, don't get so down in the dumps. So people kind of like that optimistic tone. And because I am really sort of deeply driven to understand the sort of like knowledge base behind it, I commit to doing one podcast a month where I read one academic paper and I interview the academic author and I put it out in my podcast, which is also called How to Save the World, and I write a blog article about it. So that's my kind of like forced, what do they call it? Putting in the reps, like gym membership, kind of like self-imposed academic rigor that I make sure I get through at least one a month. And I put it out on the first of every month to make sure that I'm still really understanding like sort of the theoretical basis of my work. And it's just enormously rewarding. Like every time I do an interview with one of these academic authors, it informs my work so much. Like even if nobody ever listens to my podcast ever, it's so rewarding. Like to be able to just like sort of have this insight. And I can't get enough of environmental psychology. I just love it. And I wish more people would be fans of it.
I am now very interested in this. And I really thank you for sharing that, because regardless, when we think about designing things, when we just think about narrative around climate change specifically, we're doing so with a very limited base of actual academic rigor or intellectual insight. And to be able to open up windows to the work and the research of people who are scientists, who are in the space, who are academics, is really important also for young people, because it is otherwise harder to understand where the actual work is being done. And the fact that it's feeding back into your work is also super cool. And I'm sure there's other practitioners in tech or design or whatever else that are listening and feeling inspired or learning something new, and it may be leading to collaborations that you actually don't know about. Super cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so like it is such a wonderful thing to learn about. Like one thing, for example, I've gotten from a whole bunch of interviews I just did was the power of groups. Like once you get people together in a group and you get them talking to each other and you give them a goal, like just 10 people in a room, here's your goal. Your goal is to cut down CO2. Your goal is to eat 50% vegetarian, or put vegetable garden in your kids' school, whatever. Get people together in a group with a common goal and a common vision. That is what gets people to change. That is what seeds social movements, right?
So I wanted to finish off with a final question, which we ask all of our guests on Open Ended, which is, if you had a call to action for this moment for any of our listeners, what would it be?
A call to action to join my things, or just a call to action in their own life to do something?
Either. I think all of it that's a given call to action, is to join all your things, to follow all your things, because I think it benefits everyone. But maybe just a call to action in terms of your work and really what you think that people should be doing when thinking about the planet.
Oh, well, just what I'm really excited about, and I'm actually, so it's a double individual call to action that you can do with my stuff or not with it. Which is to do with this thing called the Imagine Project, which is just really a community. Is that our next event is I'm going to be hosting an online workshop where we take a before and an after photo of an urban landscape we want to reimagine. So the task will be to go out, find an ugly area or a road, something that's covered in concrete and gross, take a photo of it, and then we're going to go into like Photoshop or Canva or landscape design tools, and then cover it with like trees and plants and beautify it and reimagine it, and then we can post it on social media, this before and this after, which is fun and inspiring and helps us get us into this imagination and this kind of optimism space. But we don't want to be just in social media and in the mind. The next step is like how do we make this happen? How do we change an audience? How do we get ordinance? Sorry, how do we get funding? So the natural step is like, once you've got the vision, to actually start sort of hacking into how to make it really, really happen. So that is my call to action for everybody. Go and take a photo of something that you think is ugly, and then get into Photoshop or canva.com and get a whole bunch of little plants and cover it over, and then post it on social media. People will love it. They'll go crazy for it, and it will inspire you to inspire that super positive creative energy of world changing that is a joy to be a part of. And every time you feel climate doomy, look at that picture you made, and it will inspire you, and it will make change happen just on its own through its power of inspiration.
Oh, that's really cool. And then do we tag you? Like, how do you see it? Should we just tag you on Instagram or wherever?
I suppose so. I haven't gotten anybody to make any of these pictures yet. But if you sign up to katiepatrick.com/imagine, you'll be able to join the Discord server, and you'll be on the email list, and you'll get an invite to these monthly group Zooms where we'll be doing these little creative workshops. So you can do it with our group or do it on your own. And just,
Okay, I'm going to
follow
do
me on
both
all the
things
social medias.
immediately. Amazing. Thank you so much, Katie. That was really informative, but also really inspiring and moving. It was wonderful to speak to you.
Thank you for listening. We welcome you to join and continue the conversation over on our Instagram at openended.design. You can also find us on LinkedIn at Open-Ended Design and our website at www.openended.design.